The night a Vietnam veteran collapsed on The Tonight Show, when Johnny Carson asked the question that shattered a war hero. For the Carson stories, Robert Sullivan never showed weakness. He survived 3 tours in Vietnam when most men didn't survive one. He came home to a country that called him baby killer and spit on his uniform. He buried his pain so deep that even his own children didn't know what he'd seen, what he'd done, what he carried. But on one November night in 1982, something happened that no war could prepare him for. A question. 8 words from Johnny Carson that cut through 15 years of armor and exposed the wound Robert had been hiding since 1970. The wound that had nothing to do with bullets or bombs. The wound that came from a telegram that reached him in the jungle. The wound of never saying goodbye to his mother. The Tonight Show was supposed to be simple that night. Robert wasn't supposed to be there at all. He was a mechanic from San Diego, a regular guy who fixed cars and kept his head down. But his daughter had written a letter to the show, told them her father's story, begged them to do something special. And somehow, impossibly, the producers said yes. What happened when Robert sat down across from Johnny Carson would become the most powerful moment in television history. Not because Robert was famous, but because he was exactly like millions of other men who'd come home from Vietnam and never really came home at all. This is the story of the night Johnny Carson asked a simple question and a war hero finally broke. Before we reveal everything, tell us where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments. Because what you're about to witness isn't just about one man. It's about every person who spent their life being strong when all they wanted was permission to fall apart. November 15th, 1982. Studio One in Burbank, California. Robert Sullivan sat in the green room backstage at The Tonight Show and wondered what the hell he was doing there. He was wearing the only suit he owned, bought 15 years ago for his father's funeral. It didn't fit quite right anymore. Too tight in the shoulders from years of working under car hoods. His hands were clean, but his knuckles were scarred, and his fingernails still had traces of grease he couldn't quite scrub out. He looked like what he was, a working man in borrowed clothes, completely out of place in Johnny Carson's world. His daughter Jennifer sat beside him, 22 years old, holding his hand like she used to when she was little. "Dad, you don't have to do this if you don't want to," she said quietly. Robert looked at her and saw his late wife in her face. Sarah had died 3 years ago. Cancer. And sometimes the resemblance hurt so much he could barely look at his own daughter. "Your letter got me here," Robert said. "Least I can do is go through with it." What Jennifer had written in that letter, Robert didn't know all the details. She'd told him some of it. How her father was a hero who never got thanked. How he'd served 3 tours in Vietnam and came home to nothing. How he'd raised 2 kids alone after their mother died. How he never complained, never asked for help, just worked 60 hours a week and made sure his kids had what they needed. How he deserved one good thing. The producers had loved it. They'd called it a feel-good story. They wanted to surprise Robert on air, thank him for his service, maybe give him tickets to Disneyland or something. Simple, sweet, good television. But Johnny Carson had read Jennifer's letter himself that morning, and he'd noticed something the producers missed. One line. "My dad hasn't smiled since my mom died, but before that, he hadn't really smiled since he came back from Vietnam in 1970. Sometimes I think part of my dad never came home at all." Carson had circled that line. Then he'd written something on his note card. One question, 8 words. And he'd decided that tonight wasn't going to be about Disneyland tickets. Tonight was going to be about truth. The stage manager came to get Robert. "You're up in 5 minutes, Mr. Sullivan. We'll bring you out during the commercial break, get you settled, then Johnny will introduce you when we come back on air." Robert nodded. His hands were shaking slightly. Jennifer squeezed his arm. "I love you, Dad. I'm so proud of you." Robert couldn't speak. He just nodded again. The stage manager led him through the backstage corridors. Robert could hear the audience laughing at something Johnny said. The sound of all those people made his chest tight. Crowds still did that to him sometimes. Ever since Vietnam. Too many people, too many variables, too many things that could go wrong. They reached the edge of the stage. Robert could see Johnny at his desk, see Ed McMahon in his chair, see the cameras and the lights and the audience. and suddenly he couldn't breathe. The jungle. It came back sometimes. The smell of it, the heat, the fear. Not now, not here. He forced himself to breathe, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the way the VA counselor had taught him. The commercial break started. The stage manager gestured for Robert to follow. Robert stepped onto that famous Tonight Show stage and felt like he was walking into an ambush. Johnny Carson stood up from behind his desk and walked over to shake Robert's hand. Up close, Carson looked older than he did on TV. 57, lines around his eyes, but the eyes themselves were kind. "Mr. Sullivan," Carson said quietly so the audience couldn't hear, "thank you for being here. Thank you for your service." Robert shook his hand. Carson's grip was firm and warm. "Thank you for having me, Mr. Carson. Call me Johnny." Carson gestured to the couch. "Have a seat. We're going to talk for a bit when we come back on air. Just be yourself. There's no wrong answers here." Robert sat down on that famous couch, the same couch where presidents and movie stars had sat. He felt ridiculous. The cameras came back on. The audience applauded as Johnny returned to his desk. "Welcome back, folks," Johnny said with that trademark smile. "We have a very special guest joining us tonight. This is Robert Sullivan from San Diego, California. Robert is a Vietnam veteran who served 3 tours between 1968 and 1970, and I wanted to bring him out here tonight because I think we owe men like Robert a debt we can never fully repay." The audience applauded. Robert sat very still, unsure what to do. "Robert, thank you for being here," Johnny said warmly. "Thank you for having me," Robert replied. His voice sounded strange to him through the microphones. "Tell me about Vietnam," Johnny said. "What was your service like?" Robert had been asked this question 1,000 times, at the VA, at the VFW hall, by well-meaning strangers who wanted to hear war stories. He had his standard answer prepared, short, simple, non-specific. "It was difficult," Robert said, "but I was proud to serve my country." Johnny nodded, but he didn't move on. He let the silence sit. "Difficult how?" Johnny asked gently. Robert shifted in his seat. "Just the conditions, the heat, being away from home." "Were you scared?" Johnny asked. No one had ever asked Robert that before. Not directly. Not on national television. "Yes, sir," Robert said quietly. "Every single day." The audience was completely silent. "What scared you the most?" Johnny asked. Robert looked at Johnny and saw something in his eyes. Not pity, not curiosity, understanding, like Johnny actually wanted to know. "Dying before I could get home to my mother," Robert said. The words came out before he could stop them. Johnny leaned forward slightly. "Tell me about your mother." And just like that, the ambush was sprung. Robert felt his chest constrict. His mother, Margaret Sullivan, the woman who'd raised him and his 3 brothers alone after their father died. The woman who'd cried when Robert enlisted but never asked him not to go. The woman who'd written him a letter every single week he was in Vietnam. The woman who died while he was in the jungle, and he'd never gotten to say goodbye. "She was a good woman," Robert said, and his voice was tight now. "She worked 2 jobs to raise 4 boys. She never complained. She just did what needed doing." Johnny nodded. "She sounds like she was strong." "Strongest person I ever knew," Robert said. "When did she pass?" Johnny asked quietly. Robert's hands clenched into fists on his lap. 1970, March 17th, while I was on my 2nd tour. "Were you able to come home?" Johnny asked. Robert shook his head. "No, they told me she'd died, sent me a telegram, but I couldn't get leave. I was in the middle of an operation. By the time I got back to the States 3 months later, she'd been buried for 3 months." A woman in the front row gasped softly. "I'm so sorry," Johnny said, and the way he said it, Robert knew he meant it. "Did you get to say goodbye before you deployed?" Johnny asked. Robert looked down at his scarred hands. "No. We had a fight before I left for my 2nd tour. I'd been home for 30 days. I was supposed to be discharged, but I re-enlisted." She didn't understand why. She begged me not to go back, said she had a bad feeling. He paused, swallowed hard. I told her she was being dramatic, told her I was fine, Told her I'd be home before she knew it, and we'd talk about it then. His voice cracked. Those were the last words I said to my mother, that we'd talk about it later. But there was no later. The audience was frozen. Some people had tears in their eyes. Johnny Carson looked at Robert Sullivan with an expression of profound compassion. Robert, Johnny said softly, I want to ask you something, and I need you to really think about it before you answer. Robert nodded, unable to speak. Johnny Carson asked 8 words that would break Robert Sullivan completely. What would you tell her if you could? The studio went absolutely silent. Robert's mouth opened, but nothing came out. His eyes filled with tears. His jaw trembled. 15 years of walls, 15 years of being strong, 15 years of never letting anyone see the pain, all came crashing down in an instant. Robert Sullivan, the war hero who'd survived 3 tours in Vietnam, began to cry on national television. Not quiet tears, deep, wrenching sobs that came from a place he'd locked away since 1970. His shoulders shook. His whole body shook. The audience didn't know what to do. Some people were crying with him. Ed McMahon had his hand over his mouth. Johnny Carson stood up from behind his desk and did something extraordinary. He walked around that desk, sat down on the couch next to Robert Sullivan, and put his hand on Robert's shoulder. It's okay, Johnny said quietly. You're safe here. But Robert couldn't stop. 15 years of grief came pouring out. Finally, through the sobs, Robert managed to speak. I'd tell her I'm sorry. The words were broken. Raw. I'm sorry I went back. I'm sorry I wasn't there. I'm sorry the last thing I did was argue with her. He was crying so hard he could barely breathe. I'd tell her I think about her every single day, that I still hear her voice, that sometimes I dream she's still alive, and when I wake up and remember she's gone, it's like losing her all over again. His voice shattered completely. And I'd tell her I don't know how to forgive myself. I survived the war, but she didn't survive waiting for me, and I don't know how to live with that. The confession hung in the air like something sacred. Johnny Carson's own eyes were wet now. Robert, Johnny said, his voice thick with emotion, I need to tell you something. Robert looked up at him through his tears. I lost my mother 2 years ago, Johnny said, and I wasn't there either when she died. I was here, doing this show, and she was in a hospital dying. And I have spent every day since then asking myself the same question you're asking. How do I forgive myself? Robert stared at him in disbelief. You too. Me too, Johnny said. And here's what I've learned. Our mothers didn't need us to be perfect. They just needed us to be their sons. Your mother knew you loved her, Robert. She knew. How do you know that? Robert asked desperately. Because mothers know, Johnny said simply. Because she wrote you letters every week. Because she raised you. Because love like that doesn't need the words. It just is. Robert grabbed Johnny's hand and held it like a lifeline. I've been carrying this for 15 years, Robert whispered. I know, Johnny said. I can see it. And I want you to know something. You're not alone. Every man who came back from that war is carrying something. You're not weak for feeling this. You're human. I was supposed to be strong, Robert said. I was a Marine. I survived combat. I raised 2 kids alone. I thought if I just kept being strong, eventually it would stop hurting. But it doesn't stop, does it? Johnny said gently. Robert shook his head. Never. Then maybe, Johnny said, it's time to stop being strong and start being honest. The words hit Robert like a revelation. For 15 years, he'd been performing strength. For his kids, for himself. For the memory of his mother who'd raised him to be tough. But the strength had become a prison. What do I do? Robert asked. Johnny looked at him with profound understanding. You stop pretending you're fine. You let people help you. You talk about her. You remember her. And you forgive yourself for being human. Robert sat very still, letting those words sink in. The audience was completely silent, witnessing something too intimate for television, but too important to look away from. She would want you to forgive yourself, Johnny said quietly. She would want you to be happy. How do you know? Robert asked. Because that's what mothers want, Johnny said. They want their children to be okay. And you're not okay, Robert, but you can be. Something broke open in Robert's chest, not breaking apart, breaking free. He looked at Johnny Carson, this man he'd only known for 10 minutes, and saw someone who understood, really understood. "Thank you," Robert whispered. Johnny pulled him into a hug. Right there on national television, two men who'd spent their lives performing strength, finally admitting they were broken. The audience stood up slowly. They didn't applaud. Not yet. They just stood in respect. When Johnny and Robert finally separated, Johnny looked into the camera. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "this is Robert Sullivan. He's not a celebrity. He's not famous. He's just a man who served his country, lost his mother, raised his children, and carried his pain alone for 15 years because he thought that's what strength meant." Johnny turned to Robert. "But tonight, Robert taught all of us what real strength looks like. It looks like being honest. It looks like being vulnerable. It looks like letting people see you're broken so they can help you heal." The audience erupted. Not polite applause, real applause. The kind you give when you've witnessed something that matters. Robert sat there, tears still streaming down his face, and for the first time in 15 years felt like maybe, just maybe, he was going to be okay. What happened after the cameras stopped rolling would prove this wasn't just a moment. It was a transformation. The show went to commercial. The audience was still standing, still applauding. Johnny kept his hand on Robert's shoulder. "Robert, Johnny said quietly. "I meant what I said. You're not alone in this." "I don't know what to do next," Robert admitted. "You're going to talk to someone," Johnny said firmly. "A real therapist. Someone who specializes in veterans. And you're going to let your kids in. You're going to tell them what you told me." "They don't need to carry my burden," Robert said. "They're already carrying it," Johnny replied. "They see you suffering and they don't understand why. Give them the truth. Let them help you." Robert nodded slowly. "And one more thing," Johnny said. He pulled out his wallet and took out a card, his personal phone number. "You call me if you need to talk, day or night. I mean it." Robert looked at the card in disbelief. "Mr. Carson, I can't." "You can and you will," Johnny said. "Because you helped me tonight too, Robert. You reminded me I'm not alone either." They came back from commercial. Johnny didn't do his usual show. He spent the rest of the hour talking with Robert about Vietnam, about loss, about healing. He opened up the phone lines and veterans started calling in. Men who'd never told their stories. Men who'd been carrying the same weight Robert carried. The show ran 20 minutes over. NBC let it go. When it finally ended, Robert stood backstage with his daughter Jennifer. She was crying. "Dad, I had no idea," she said. "I never told you," Robert replied. "I thought I was protecting you." "You don't have to protect me anymore," Jennifer said. "Just let me love you. Let me help you." Robert pulled his daughter into a hug and cried again. But these tears were different. These tears were relief. Johnny Carson kept his promise. He called Robert the next week to check on him. Then the week after that, he connected Robert with a therapist who specialized in PTSD. He paid for the sessions himself anonymously. Within a month, Robert was in a support group with other Vietnam veterans. Men who understood. Men who'd been there. Men who were trying to heal. Robert started talking about his mother. Really talking. Not just the sanitized version, the real grief, the real guilt, the real pain. And slowly, gradually, the weight started to lift. 6 months after the Tonight Show appearance, Robert called Johnny. "I wanted to tell you something," Robert said. "What's that?" "I visited my mother's grave today, first time since the funeral, and I talked to her. Really talked to her. Told her I was sorry. Told her I loved her. And Johnny, I swear I could feel her forgiving me." Johnny's voice was thick on the other end of the line. "I'm so proud of you, Robert." "I couldn't have done it without you asking that question," Robert said. "Sometimes the questions we're most afraid to answer are the ones that set us free," Johnny replied. Robert lived another 32 years. He died in 2014 at age 80. At his funeral, his daughter Jennifer spoke about the night her father went on The Tonight Show. "That night," she said, "I watched my father finally come home from Vietnam. Not physically, spiritually. He'd been gone for 15 years, and in 8 words, Johnny Carson brought him home." The tape of that interview became required viewing at VA hospitals across the country. Therapists used it to help veterans understand that strength isn't about never breaking, it's about having the courage to heal. Johnny Carson never forgot Robert Sullivan. When Johnny died in 2005, they found a photograph in his desk. Robert and Johnny on that Tonight Show couch, both crying, holding each other. On the back, Johnny had written, "The bravest man I ever met, November 15th, 1982." Because on that night, 30 million people watched a Vietnam veteran break down on national television. But what they really witnessed was a man finally laying down a burden he was never meant to carry alone. If this story moved you, share it with a veteran you know. Tell them it's okay to not be okay. Tell them there's strength in asking for help. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Because tonight we all learned the same lesson. You don't have to be strong all the time. You just have to be honest. This is the Carson Stories, where the untold moments are the ones that matter most. Disclaimer. This story is a dramatized narrative inspired by The Tonight Show's legacy of creating genuine emotional moments and the universal themes of grief, trauma, and healing. While Johnny Carson was a real person who hosted The Tonight Show, this specific incident, Robert Sullivan, and all details are fictionalized for storytelling purposes to honor the real experiences of Vietnam veterans and the spirit of authentic human connection that made The Tonight Show legendary.